Hello and welcome back. This is the Mini Town Bicycle Series, video number 9. In the last video, we bent the chainstays, made a basic dummy axle from threaded rod, and then fixtured it all up onto the jig. In this video, we're gonna tack the chainstays to the dropouts, then weld the chainstays to the bottom bracket shell, throw the wheel on and check alignment. Let us begin. Alright, so before we get going here, I got a few corrections I need to make. The first is regarding the Cobra tube bender. So last week when using the Cobra bender, I put my first bends in the wrong place. Joe of Cobra Frames contacted me soon after that video to help me out with some tips. He says when the lower bending arm is at 0 degrees, the center line of that arm is the point of tangency. And it's the center of the arm that you want to line your bend placements with. Thanks for clearing that up, Joe. The next correction is another tip from Joe, but this time it's about the dropout offset in BikeCAD. So last week I fudged the offset by inputting a wider axle. Well, there's a better way to do it. In BikeCAD, open up the rear dropout settings. There are 2 inputs for chainstays and seat stay offsets, labeled CZ and SZ. In my case, I would set both somewhere around 14 millimeters. Alright, I got the chainstays all cleaned up. I'm going to get these on the jig and then get them tacked up. So now that I have them cleaned up, I noticed that I can see better. And one of the things I noticed is that right here there's a tiny gap. It's less than a millimeter, but in this situation, that's a pretty big deal, at least to me anyway. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna give it a little file on this side, just kind of brush it off. So that's a lot better. I think I'm happy with that. Okay, so all my tacks on the shell side are done. I started with this one right here, and I made a little hole. That was my first one. So what I did is I kind of moved over to either side and tacked on both sides there. This was, for some reason, super tricky. It could be the visibility or whatever, or you just have some days that are not great. And I think this is one of those days. And here we are on the bottom end, and you can see right here I got a big hole. So I gotta fix that. I'll fill it once I get this thing off, and I might not fill this until the welding stage because it's so big. I did manage to get 2 tacks on the bottom end. I think in the future what I'll do in this situation is I'll try to get like a tack on the outer sides of the chainstays, and then I'll take it off, and then I'll do the other tacks so that I can see a lot better. The final tacks before I take this off the jig are the 2 chainstay ends. I'm going to tack up here, and then on the bottoms here and here. All right, we are all tacked up and we're ready to take this thing off. This side's a bit hot. There was quite a gap under here, which I'll show you guys in a bit. There we go. Good. So here's the top sides of those tacks. Here's the other one. Here's the bottom sides. This one's a little light, but I think it'll be okay. Before I cap this, I want to cut a nice taper here on both ends. And so that's going to be a little tricky. I'll have to get in there with a hacksaw rather than the bandsaw. Here's a look at the wheel alignment. So I'm going to place this on the frame and just kind of mark off where it's touching the tire on this side, which is right here basically. Alright, so there's an obvious misalignment situation going on here with the, so if you were to look at the seat tube and project that center plane straight back, the seat tube would basically be like this. So the wheel is a little bit, well, let's say more than a little. Looks like we're over to the right by about 5 millimeters. I had this on here and I was pushing down, you know, trying to get this lower, and the obvious happened, which is it busted off the tacks. So I think at this point I obviously have to get this tack back on there, but I think the next thing I'm gonna do is when I weld these chainstays on here, when I actually get to the welding stage, I need this to kind of push down a little. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a full weld on the bottom, and that will hopefully pull it down. And then on the other side, I'm going to make a full weld on the top, and that'll pull the other side up. And we'll see how that goes. Alright, so I got the chainstay tacked back on, and I'm going to show you guys a little trick. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try using the dummy axle to kind of put these into position and then weld it. And what I did is I loosened one side, and I know this side needs to go up, so I'm pushing it up a bit, and then I'm gonna tighten this down. I'll probably tighten it more, but you get the idea. And so now this is kind of up, and when I weld it, hopefully it tries to stay in that position. This is the first weld, and this is the side that needed to go like this, like that. And then I decided to weld on the bottom of the other side as well, even though this needs to go the other direction. And I'll show you why. Okay, so let's say this is my bottom bracket, and this is my chainstay. And let's say I want the chainstay to go in this direction. On one side, I welded down here. I put in a weld right there. And so you would think, okay, now it's gonna pull it this way. But let me show you another thing. It also could possibly work, say you want to pull it this way, it could also possibly work if you were to weld this side first. And the reason for that is what happens is you weld this side first, even though you want it to pull this way. This acts like a shim. It's actually, the weld has cooled and it's solid all up in here, and it acts like a shim or a hinge, for example. So now when you weld this side, when you start welding in here, this is all getting warm, and it's turning to metal mush essentially, and it's giving it space to kind of squeeze in, and this is acting like a hinge. So I think in the case of these chainstays, one of these, I'm not sure which one, but one of these is gonna work. I have a feeling this is gonna be the side that pulls in the opposite direction of where I started. So that's why on the bottom bracket I welded both bottom ends, because one of them is going to do one or the other, and we're going to find out. I have a feeling I overshot it, but we will find out. The wheel is still shifted a bit this way. I don't know, I'd say like 5 millimeters still, which is a pretty good amount. So what I'm gonna do, I'm going to throw a hot pass right over this weld right here. Alright, so that basically did nothing. Well, it did work, but I'll tell you why it doesn't move the wheel in the way I wanted it to. So I'm going to loosen this side, and I'll show you that it did in fact move up when I did my hot pass over the chainstays. So you can see it actually did pull this back up. But what's happening here is, because of the rear axle doing what rear axles do, when I tighten this down, it's kind of putting everything back into the way it wants to settle, and that is the ends of these, the faces of these nuts here are flat, and it's flattening everything back out again. So that's what's happening there. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fix this situation, because I don't like that. I'm going to run a hot pass on the opposite ends again, so that it kind of gets back into alignment here, because this is no good. And then I will need to work on the seat post and just try to twist both of these chainstays at the same time, so that these are aligned, but kind of doing that. All right, so I really wanted to get this aligned with the seat tube before I carried on with these welds. I did get this situation straightened out with the one side being a little lower. So these are now on the same level. I actually got this all aligned, and the way I did that is I clamped this down like this. You get a piece of wood holding the chainstays onto a rigid flat surface, and then I've got both sides clamped here. And then what I did is I stuck a pipe in here, and I of course padded this side that I was putting force on, and because you don't want to mess up the inside of here where your seat tube goes, so you want to make sure you get a piece of leather or shim stock or just something in there that's not gonna grind it all up in there. And then what I did is I just pushed and put enough force to kind of get these twisted back to where they needed to be. One very important thing I almost forgot to tell you, when you're doing this, you really want to make sure you have your dummy axle in there. It's super important that your dummy axle is in place and tightened when you're securing this down, because it needs something to hold these in parallel with each other. Okay, and here's how we did. So I tightened the wheel onto the chainstays, dropouts, just to make sure we don't have any false positives. And here's the left side, and here's the right side. Okay, here's the top side. It's all welded up, and yeah, it got pretty hot in some of these, especially down in here. It got really hot because I had to keep starting and stopping over again. Here's the bottom end, and somewhere down in here, I think it was right here, I made a hole and I filled it up, and it's all filled. It looks okay now. Here's a closer look down inside here. Normally I think I would weld in here first and then weld the outsides, and the reason for that is in here was the last spot, and I tend to do the hardest place, in this case the hardest place, last. So what ended up happening, because I welded this last, is I ended up pulling the chainstays together, and they're kind of squeezing the dummy axle right now, but when I get the bridge in here, I'll set that up so it pushes it back out. And that's another thing to be really careful of when you're welding your bridge in. You can actually pull it in even more. So, and I did that on my longtail build, so I'm gonna really try to avoid it on this one. Okay y'all, that's all for this video. In the next one, we're gonna cut some flat 4130 chromoly stock and make some caps for the ends of these chainstays. Hopefully that goes without a hitch. We shall see. Alright, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.